So if we could put up Revelation 12 from last week. So last week, I'm not going to read it, but we encountered in Revelation 12, we were introduced to sort of two characters in John's vision. One was a dragon, and one was a woman. And when you see dragon in Scripture, that is referring to some spiritual being. And what we saw in the story was that this dragon was the force behind all the evil empires that had been persecuting God's people. It was the one that was influencing these evil empires and empowering these empires. But because the dragon had been defeated, he went after this woman. And who the woman represents is because we see it in the 12 stars. Whenever you see the number 12 in stars, that usually refers to God's people. So the woman represented God's people or the church. So because the dragon was defeated, the dragon decides to go after the church. And so the question we asked last week was something like this. If we go to the next slide, if the church is so important for the dragon to attack, how important is it for us to protect? In other words, if the enemy of God chooses to attack the church, that tells you how important it is. And so how much do we value what's happening here, or when we gather in community groups or whatever it is? How much do we really value and protect what the church does and what the church represents in the kingdom of God? And the point of the whole story with the dragon and the woman is John is trying to give the spiritual background to God's people of why they're experiencing such a difficult life. Why are they experiencing persecution? Why are they experiencing suffering? And it's this behind-the-scenes peek that's saying you're not just experiencing persecution by accident. Your life as a Christian is not difficult by accident, but there's actually the spiritual world that's influencing the natural world. And so it's no accident, right, that we are being targeted. It's no accident that our lives are actually more difficult because of our beliefs, because the systems of the world are not set up to support our beliefs. The systems of the world are not set up so that we could easily live a kingdom kind of lifestyle. It's completely the opposite. The systems of the world are set up so that we look foolish for following Christ. The systems of the world give us a harder time for following Christ. But again, behind all that is actually a spiritual influence that has some power over the systems of the world. And so the church has been asking this question then, and I think it's this question now, is it worth it? Is it worth the suffering? Is it worth the persecution? Is it worth the difficulty? Is it worth the sacrifice? Is it worth it? Right? Is it worth our lives? So in Matthew chapter 10, here's what Jesus said to his disciples. Behold, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to the courts and flog you in their synagogues. And you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them and the Gentiles. And this came true. Right? The early church members were dragged before governors. Were punished for their faith. And so is it worth it? So, let's ask that question today. Is our faith worth it? If it costs our standing in society because of our beliefs, if it costs us our jobs because we stand firm on our beliefs, if it costs opportunities for us to advance because we stand on our beliefs, is it worth it? That's the question the church was asking. That's the question John is addressing in Revelation. And that's the question I think we should be asking. But what we saw in Revelation 12 is a reminder that the church will be victorious. So if we could go to the next slide. Verse 7, now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was defeated. There was no longer any place for them in heaven, and the great dragon was thrown down, the ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers have been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. Verse 11, and they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death. And so let's leave that up here. But this is this reminder. Is it worth it? Yes, because guess what? You're going to be victorious. In the end, even though the choices you make go against society, even though the choices you make put you in situations that are not great for your self-being, we're going to win. The dragon has been defeated in the heavens, and the dragon is going to be defeated here on the earth. And there's sort of three ingredients to how the church is to overcome the dragon. Three ingredients are the blood of the Lamb, the word of our testimony, and not loving our lives even unto death. Now those last two are linked if you look at the grammar, but the blood of the Lamb, the word of our testimony, for we don't love our lives even unto death. So I just want to deconstruct this a little bit, and we're going to look at a story in Matthew that illustrates this, I think, pretty well. So in Matthew 16, this is an exchange between Jesus and Peter. It says, when Jesus came to the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked the disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. He said to them, but who do you say I am? Verse 16, Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. What is this rock? And so there's a lot of different interpretations, but what I'm going to say in the context of what we're saying is this rock refers to Peter's confession that Jesus is the Christ. Why? Because the way we overcome is the word of our testimony. In other words, standing on the truth. And Peter recognizes and will stand on the truth that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. It's that testimony, that truth that the church is going to be built on. It's that truth that the gates of hell will not prevail against. And so when we go up against the dragon, we have to be founded on that truth of who Jesus is. So victory for the church comes first and foremost to the blood of the Lamb, but I think it moves forward as we cling on to the truth of who Jesus is and build a foundation on that, the word of our testimony. So Peter's doing great, all the right answers, and then it goes a little bit awry. Next part of chapter 16, it says this. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer. That's not a good thing. Many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed. That's even worse. And on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but the things of man. What went wrong? Right? Peter was doing great, right? He was standing on this word of the testimony. But what is happening here? What is Peter afraid of? He is fearing death. Because in his eyes, Jesus dying was not a win, because he was seeing it through human eyes. In his eyes, Jesus dying was a loss. Why? Because to them, you defeat the enemy by crushing the enemy through force. That's what they were all waiting for, right? They were waiting for a Messiah who was going to come and bring an army and overthrow the government. How do you overthrow governments? You overthrow the governments with force. So you beat the dragon with force. You fight against the dragon with force. But that's not what Jesus is showing. He's saying the way to victory is not the same way the world fights wars. The way to victory is not just overpowering through force and sheer will your enemy. That the way to victory is actually very upside down. That the way that Christ is going to win victory is actually to humble himself and die. But Peter doesn't see this. He sees death as a loss. And I want to make this point. I think the fear of death is one of the primary weapons the dragon uses to get us to take our eyes off of God and not align our choices with God's kingdom, but instead make choices that align with the way the world does things. The fear of death is one of the primary weapons the dragon uses to get us off track. And so Jesus sees the demonic influence behind Peter's fear. Because he doesn't say, Peter, you're wrong. What does he say? Get behind me, Satan. In other words, what's he saying? The dragon is influencing you. The dragon is causing you to say that. It's not the Spirit speaking to you anymore. The Spirit showed you I am the Christ, but the dragon is forcing you to see death as a loss, when I need you to see death as the way that the kingdom actually works. And we've talked about what it means to live life that looks like you're losing, but in God's eyes, it's actually the way to victory. Jesus says this further in Matthew chapter 16, verse 24. He told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? So the life Jesus is calling us to live is actually one where we lose our lives. Mostly figuratively, sometimes literally. And this is such a challenge to us, I think, to what true life looks like. Because in the world's economy, winning is about climbing higher, isn't it? In the world's economy, winning is that you get further and further in life, and it doesn't really matter who you step on along the way, but you gain higher status and higher wealth. But in God's economy, winning is actually about taking up the cross, humbling yourself, so not climbing higher, but actually bending down. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. I want to just take a moment to talk about martyrdom. Okay? Martyrdom is not really a reality we face necessarily here in Taiwan, but I do want to make us aware that it is a reality that is still prevalent in the world. People dying. So here, if we can show some of the definitions. I pulled this out from an organization called Voice of the Martyrs. Okay? So what is a martyr? Martyr, simply said, is one who chooses to suffer death rather than deny Jesus Christ or his work. Does that characterize our hearts? If we had the choice between living and denying Christ, or dying and hanging on to our testimony, the word of our testimony, what would we choose? A martyr is one who bears testimony to the truth of what he's seen or heard or knows. Someone who'll speak the truth as if you're in court, where you're compelled to speak the truth. A martyr is one who sacrifices something very important to further the kingdom of God. A martyr is one who endures severe or constant suffering for their Christian witness. To what extent does this describe us? I think in the very literal sense, it doesn't. But in some figurative senses, maybe we do face these kind of things. Martyrdom is very much a reality. Back in the 19th century, missionaries that would go into inner Africa actually packed their stuff in coffins. So when they took their clothing and their supplies, they put it in a coffin, because they knew that if death and disease didn't get them, then maybe persecution would get them. Isn't that crazy? That as missionaries, they're basically saying, I'm not just going in to preach the gospel into Africa, I'm going to die. Whether literally or figuratively, I'm going to die. So if you're interested in sort of reading up some of the more modern days, I would recommend the Voice of the Martyrs. It's an organization that kind of tells the stories. I just want to pick one in particular. This is from 1996 in Indonesia. So this is a story of a guy named Stanley. So I'll just read it. Okay? So Stanley, a recent graduate of Palembang Bible School in Jakarta, was eager to take on the challenge of the mission field. The Lord sent him to the very remote island of Mentawai. Here, inhabitants mix witchcraft and occult with Islam. Stanley was very bold in preaching the gospel, telling Muslims to burn their idols when they received Jesus. One day, a newly saved Muslim burned his idol, which contained a rolled-up scroll from the Quran. When area Muslims heard of this, they became very angry and reported Stanley to the officials. He was arrested for burning a Quran and was thrown in jail. The pastor of the Bible school heard about Stanley's arrest and went immediately to see him. When Pastor Siwi arrived at the jail, he was told Stanley had been transferred to prison. Days later, when Pastor Siwi finally found Stanley, he was found severely beaten, bruised, and unconscious. Repeated blows to the head had left him in a coma. Pastor Siwi did what he could to care for Stanley and make him more comfortable. Stanley seemed to revive slightly as he did this. Pastor Siwi asked with tears, "Stanley, this is Pastor Siwi. Can you hear me?" But Stanley could not move or speak. All he could do was lie on his back and cry. Soon after his pastor's visit, Stanley went to be with the Lord. Stanley's death made a great impact on those who knew him. In the middle of the night, 7 of his fellow students went to the Bible school superintendent requesting that they be sent to preach the gospel on Mentawai Island where Stanley died. His death also impacted his hometown. There, 53 people made decisions to attend Bible school, including Stanley's mother and sister. Upon graduation, 7 of them went to evangelize where Stanley had died. His mother was asked, "Are you not afraid to die?" She answered, "Why should I be afraid to die?" Stanley's life made a lasting difference on the island of Mentawai. 11 Muslims there placed their trust in Christ because of Stanley's faith. There was also a revival among more than 300 traditional Christians on the island. Most of them were once bound by alcohol, cigarettes, and gambling, but now their spirits are on fire to seek God and study the Bible. Pray for the many Christians whose courageous lives and vibrant, fearless witness are making tremendous impact on nations such as Indonesia. Although they've been harassed, beaten, imprisoned, they have refused to deny Jesus. Pray for a harvest of souls from the seeds they have sown. And that's one of the tamer stories from, it's actually a book, this will date me a little bit, called Jesus Freaks, co-authored by, anyone know? DC Talk, yes, okay. But in any case, they just tell story after story of Christians in either Muslim countries or communist countries that are trying to kill religion, just being tortured, being killed. But what we see all the time is that the people who identify as martyrs still are faithful to Christ. They'll witness to the guards that are beating them. And you'll see that truly, truly, as God promised, it's the blood of the martyrs on which the church is really grown. And you see that as blood is shed, and there's another story in Iran where this happened, as blood is shed, revival actually happens as people stay faithful to God. And you know, I don't want to look at these things. I don't want to believe that these things happen, but I do share this story just to make us aware that even in our modern day, in a time where we feel we're so much more understanding of differences, so much more accommodating to different belief systems, in our modern day, there are still Christians being persecuted and killed for their faith. It's happening. And I have to read these stories to remind myself because I don't feel it or see it here. I remember when I watched The Passion of the Christ, if anyone ever watched that, and you watch Jesus getting beaten. And I remember my dad saying, "No, that can't be how it really happened." And in my mind, I'm like, it is how it really happened. The beating of Jesus was that violent. And sometimes I think about martyrdom, I'm like, oh, that was just back then. Or these are just stories we make up. But no, it's true. There are people who don't love their lives even unto death, people who don't fear death, and so they die for their faith. Or they face persecution for their faith. They face suffering for their faith. And it's happening today. And I hope it's something that we could just keep in our prayers as we sort of think about how God is moving. But for us, that story feels very, very far away from our reality. And I can understand that. It feels very far away from my reality. And I don't think, as I mentioned last week, we have a really strong sense of how the fear of death influences us in ways that we don't even realize. How the fear of death and the things associated with death, like suffering and hardship and pain, actually influence and help us to make choices that are not aligned with the kingdom. As I said, it's really the fear of death that the dragon uses to take our eyes off how we're supposed to be living and align ourselves with how he wants us to live. But the fear of death is subtle because we don't really think about it or we don't associate certain choices we make with the fear of death. So I want to just explore a little bit, what is it about the fear of death that the enemy uses to cause us to align with him? First and foremost, this: the fear of death, suffering, discomfort tempts us into taking control of our own survival and well-being. Right? The fear of death tempts us into taking control of our own survival and well-being. And so what happens is, because of the fear of death, we become self-focused instead of other-focused and Christ-focused. I sometimes, I play this scenario in my mind. Maybe it's just me. What if there was some disaster, like a plane crash or a boat is sinking, and I'm on that boat? Would I save others? You know, because you hear about all those heroic stories of the person that gave up their life so that others could survive. So what if there was a plane crash and it crashed in the ocean and it's sinking? Would I use my life to save others, or would I save myself? And then there's good reasons to save myself, right? My family and all these other things. And I think about that, and I'm pretty sure I would save myself. Just something about the survival instinct in me. And then part of me wonders, to what extent does that show up in smaller ways, where I'm concerned more about saving myself than serving others, because I want to look out for my survival and well-being. That's what happened in the fall, right? What did the dragon say to Eve then? The dragon tempted Eve by saying what? God doesn't have your best interest. God is holding out on you. So what did the dragon say? So take control of your destiny. Eat that fruit. That's the same thing, right? The fear of death actually tempts us to take control of our own destiny, as if we are our own saviors. Eat that fruit. God's not going to do it. Eat that fruit. Why do nations go to war? Nations go to war. I mean, there's a lot of reasons, but I'll just give you one way that's related to this. I think nations go to war, and partly it's because of power. But power to do what? I think it's partly power to control your destiny and survival. Because I see a nation there that has the resources that I need, so they're not giving it to me, so I'm going to go attack that nation, so now I have the resources to control my own survival. Or there's that nation over there that's going to attack me, they're threatening me, and so I'm going to go and take them over lest they threaten my survival. It's about this power, but power what? To control our own destiny and to provide for ourselves to avoid death. Do we see how that aligns with the enemy? That the enemy is saying, you take control of your own happiness, you take control of your own survival, you do it on your terms. And what that takes is that you take power over the things that influence your potential death or suffering or pain. It doesn't have to be just death. And so having power helps us feel like we can control our own survival. And losing power and feeling vulnerable, being powerless, actually motivates us to act in ways to retake power in ways that are not godly, in ways that are actually destructive and not leading to the kingdom. Because this instinct to survive kicks in, we feel the need to have power or control over it. So the enemy says, do it this way if you want to survive. Right? Come with me if you want to live. Only one person caught that. Second thing, how I think the enemy uses the fear of death is we start to view death as an end. And because we view death as an end, we start to view this life as temporary. Right? We view death as an end, and so we view this life as temporary. And because we view this life as temporary, it causes all sorts of panic, doesn't it? Because we view this life as temporary, it causes all kinds of anxiety, doesn't it? There's this weird thing that happens in education. Maybe it's only in Taiwan, but I don't think so. Where students get so anxious about a quiz. What is a quiz? A quiz is meant to inform you, the student, what you need to work on before the final test. It's a communication tool for me as a teacher to show you, hey, you need to work on this. But I say, there's a quiz tomorrow. Oh my goodness, there's such stress on students. Why? Because to them, they see that as the only chance they have to demonstrate to me that they are experts in what I have taught them. They're not seeing the journey. They're not seeing the process of learning being iterations. They're seeing there's this end, this is my only chance. And because this is my only chance, if I mess it up, you know what's going to happen? I'm going to get an Asian fail, which is an A- in their books. And because I'm going to get an Asian fail, I will not go to Harvard. And because I do not go to Harvard, I will not get a good job. I will be living in my parents' basement for the rest of my life. That's how they see it. Because they see that this thing, this temporary thing, is their only chance. And that's what causes a lot of anxiety to us, is we think this life is all we got. And so what do we have to do? We have to maximize our enjoyment of it. We have to optimize our experience of it. And again, that could be good if we realize this lifetime is all we got to serve God. But oftentimes what we think is, I got to get the most out of life that I can because it is temporary. I fear death. I want to prevent death. But because I can't prevent death, I'm going to do everything I can to hoard all the experiences and success I can, even if the way I do that is not aligned with God's kingdom. Think about this. If death did not exist, would we spend so much energy hoarding resources and experiences, stories and successes? If death did not exist, would nations really go to war to get the resources they think they need? If death did not exist, would I really treat someone who stands in the way of my success as just being an obstacle, as opposed to seeing them as a loved person of God? Because if death didn't exist, there's no end. So there's nowhere to run to. There's no finish line. There's no FOMO. Right? I'm not going to fear missing out on anything because there's no death. There's no end. So why would, maybe this person standing in the way of my promotion or my happiness, if death didn't exist, I could still treat that person in a loving way because it's not like there's an end to it. It's not like they're going to prevent me from eventually reaching whatever I'm looking for. So the question I want to leave us with is, in what subtle ways does death influence the choices we make and the way that we live? Okay, just think about that. In what subtle ways does death, or the fear of death, influence the choices we make and the way that we live? Whether that fear of death is in the background of your mind or in the foreground of your mind, how does it influence us from living lives that are actually not aligned with God? In what ways does the fear of death influence us to live in a way that's not about trusting God, but about preserving ourselves? Again, not just death, pain, suffering, whatever. All these things associated with death. In what ways does it tempt us to achieve happiness on our own terms? Right? But what if we understood that the reality is there's going to come a time where there's no pain or suffering? Would we live differently? Would we treat others differently? Would we fight battles differently? If we understood that life was not temporary, would we work as hard to accumulate stuff, or would we work harder to love and give and take up that cross? Because the message in Revelation is we don't overcome the dragon by the world's way. We overcome the dragon, and we truly live life when we stop loving our lives. That's weird, right? That's not a very easy message to preach. We truly live life when we stop loving our own lives and instead put our trust in a God who says live in a way that it looks like you're losing, but actually that's the way to fulfill the plan. That's the way to live as I've called you to live.